Hello, everyone, and good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show, The Nation Talks. And as always, I guarantee you, and we always guarantee you, 60 exciting minutes, and this is no exception. I'm so glad you've joined us. And you know, it's been another great day for British democracy. We learned today from Sky News that Richard Sharp, who is the Chancellor's old boss at Goldman Sachs, is to be appointed the new BBC chairman. Of course, this is absolutely unconnected to the fact that he has made £400,000 in contributions to the Conservative Party. So now we have a situation, which I suspect could only happen in the UK, where the BBC chairman and the BBC chief executive will both be prominent Conservatives. Who knew? Also, in unconnected news, the New York Times today describes the British ruling class as mendacious and intellectually limited hustlers. Who could possibly argue with that, perhaps? So thanks for joining us. We're delighted that you're here. As I said before, we have another great guest this evening, and I'm really excited that he's able to be with us. Tonight, the TNT Show welcomes Professor Murray Pittock. Now, Murray is Vice Principal at Glasgow University, and if, like me, you believe that education is key to a successful country, then tonight is a real and rare opportunity to hear from somebody who really knows what education is all about. And we're taking your questions live. We already had a couple of three. Do send us your questions. You can email me at john@cleash.com, or you can go through the conventional arrangements, which you'll see posted on screen. The TNT show, of course, is The Nation Talks. So this is very much your show as much as anyone else's. We do want to hear from you. We'll try and take as many questions as we possibly can. Now, to our guest. Tonight, The Nation talks to Murray Pittock. How are you, Murray? How are you coping with the pandemic?
Oh, I'm absolutely fine, John. I mean, I have to say, luckier than a lot of people. So, I mean, I don't have young children at home. That's one thing. And as I was saying to you earlier, my daughters actually made a bar for me at Christmas so that I can have a pub at home. So it's still there. It's called Easy Mungo's, and it's next door. So I mean that gives me an evening in the pub without actually contributing any guidelines, and actually the drink's cheaper too.
Yeah, well, daughters are known for being sympathetic to fathers and understanding their needs.
Absolutely. In that case, very much so. I have to say, I'm really enjoying these few days of weather we're getting with the rain off and the sun in the sky for its 6 or 7 hours, because it makes a huge difference. And it's also very much the kind of weather I had when I was a child growing up beside the River Dee in Aberdeen. So, I mean, it's as an East Coaster, this is my kind of weather. I just absolutely, I love it, and I couldn't get enough of it.
Tell us all about growing up in Aberdeen. What was your family life like? Brothers, sisters? How did it work for you?
So there we are. So I mean, it was I was growing up myself. But my first experience, my parents both worked at the university, so they had reasonably flexible hours. My first experience education was at St. Peter's Nursery when I was 3. And then I got a very big shift because I went up the road to a primary school in Kincorth, the big scheme on the edge of the city. And I was there till I was about 11, and then went on to Aberdeen Grammar School. So school right through in Aberdeen, and I met some great people there, and there was some real innovations. One of the things that Aberdeen, I did quite a bit was children's theatre, and that was although they spread out with Aberdeen. That was actually an innovation carried out, first of all, in Aberdeen in the 1950s. And that was hugely important, like debating, which I might, come on to in terms of education experience a wee bit later. I think it gives people a sense of confidence. It gives people a sense of horizon. It gets people mixing with each other on a joint project and, learning those kind of skills of teamwork and so on, which have become a cliche. And I'm still really, good friends with 2 or 3 of the great people that I met through that, Kenny Luke and Ed Steele and so on. They're lovely. They're lovely people. But the thing about that was it was one of the first things that taught me about the importance of horizons. And I think having a high horizon is something that people, because of background and circumstance, and maybe native boldness or not having native boldness, and that's maybe a Scottish issue too. Actually, they don't give themselves the kind of horizon they could, and that's been my my guiding mission throughout life, is to change people's horizons and really help them to be. It's a cliche, but it's so true. To be the best they can be, not because anybody can be anything, but you can be whatever you want, because you can't, but because actually almost everybody can lift their horizon. And when you lift your horizon, you transform what you can see, where you stand, who you can meet, and what you can become.
I think that's terribly, terribly important. I remember, for various reasons, I ended up spending a year in the States. And that's one of the first things I noticed was the cultural difference. I come from an educational system which was highly commendable in many respects, but it did have a certain mentality about sit up and shut up. You're here to learn. I found that in the States, it was very different. From the time that I met the head teacher, who rejoiced in the name of Bob Funk.
That's a brother called Blue, had he?
When we took our son to the local school, we were advised to seek out Bob Funk, and Bob turned out to be a terribly pleasant guy. But what struck me very forcibly about pretty much everyone we met was they were incredibly positive, regardless of their background, experience, their financial situation. Everyone sort of looked to the horizon. They didn't look at their feet. They looked ahead to see, and it was all. I mean, it's very much a cultural thing. It wasn't as if they learned this at school so much as that the school was part and parcel of that mentality. And also, what struck me very forcibly was I once went to a local politician here many years ago who was standing for this area. He was a Labour MP at that time, and I asked him, "What is your purpose tonight? What is your main theme? If you can just reduce it to a sentence." And he said, "Listen to this." He said, "My job is to lower expectations."
Absolutely.
Isn't that the most shocking thing you've ever heard?
But it can be so true. And there's a good side to that kind of the proverbial Scots equality, car the feet for that big bastard. But there's a really bad side too. And I remember years ago I had a student, and she'd come to university as a mature student. Her last day at primary school, she'd been told that she could get to university. She was regarded as one of the brightest kids in the school. And she came home and said that really proudly to her father, and he said, "The only thing you'll do in university at Hen is clean the flares." And it's just, for a girl of 10 or 11, 12, up to her father, it's just terrible.
Yeah.
But that's what you get when you lower expectations.
Exactly. And it's very sad. So you've taken the view, you look to the horizon, I assume you challenge people as well as yourself, because you want to get the best out of yourself and out of them. I take it that's one cornerstone of your approach to education.
It is, and also, it's to developing people and staff, and staff generally. So at every level, people can always do more. If you are not developing, you are sliding backwards. Life goes on, and if you don't want it to be repetition, if you want any improvement, you've got to do something about it all the time. And I guess that is a lesson better understood in the United States and in East Asia than it always is. It always is here. But one of the things about horizons is you learn most of what you learn from other people, and that's one of the difficulties in the present situation, that you can't learn. It's great to be here, and we're getting a lot out. We'll get a lot out of it. You can't learn everything you can learn from other people by Zoom, because people are a presence as well as a virtual as well as a virtual presence. They're a real presence. But again, that's one of the important things about performance. And I started with theatre, and I was going to go on to mention debating. So when when I left to go to University of Glasgow, which was in the end of the 1970s, I got really into debating, and that was very important to me. And also there I met Charles Kennedy, Liam Fox, group, and several other people who've went on to make a name for themselves, as well as actually encountering for the first time folk from a previous generation like Ming Campbell and Donald Dewar in the debates. And again, you learn a lot from those people, and not just from what they say. You learn a lot from the way they interact. Charles Kennedy was one of the two most skillful student politicians I ever knew, and the other one I came to when I went down south to Oxford. And so I was debating partners with a guy, you may have heard of him, but don't worry if you haven't. But called Boris Johnson, and he is also with Charles the best student politician I ever knew. And I learnt a good deal, certainly from Charles, and I learnt other things from Boris. I'll just give you one. Everybody deserves a genuine Boris Johnson anecdote, so here's one. So I was in a debate in Oxford in the 1986. He was president of the union at that time, and he came up to me afterwards, and we'd won. It was unusual. We'd not expected to win because student opinion was generally in the other direction. So he said to me, "That was what wonderful speech, Murray. Absolutely wonderful speech. There's just one thing I'd really advise you to avoid in the future." And I said, "What's that?" He said, "You sound as if you meant it."
He was a cynic back then.
He certainly was. A cheerful cynic, but a cynic.
Any other thoughts that he left you with, having had that? Did you spend any more time with him than just that passing epithet, or did you actually debate with him?
Oh yeah, well, we were debating partners, and we won the Oxford Championship together. So I did spend some. I did spend a bit of time because he was in my college as well. So I wasn't in the inner circle or everything. It's very socially graded, and I had not gone to the kind of school, had the kind of background to be in the circle. But I knew him. I knew him pretty well, and he was very, very shrewd. You weren't allowed to canvass in student elections there, but one of the things he did was actually employ a pollster, which you could do because nobody had ever thought of that. So he had a running poll for the hot spots and cold spots and his support right across the university. And he was able to, to spend a lot of time with the cold spots and heat them up a bit. So it was kind of instant focus groups. And that, for somebody who was 19 or 20, that was really smart.
Yeah. I mean, that's very typical of American politicians at all levels. I mean, I'm reading Obama's book just now. His the first, I think it's the first part of his two-volume biography, and he talks a lot about the fact that he was introduced to pollsters fairly early on, but he made it sound as if, oh look, I really missed out on my education.
It is an education, because actually the guy Boris used, Frank Luntz, went on to be quite a big Republican pollster in the US. So it was very much that culture. Yeah. And, if you've got enough, in terms of US polling, if you've got enough money, goodness, how you can segment the details and focus in on them. Yeah.
Well, I think the last election in the States, bar one, in which Donald Trump was elected, showed that there's a lot that can be done through social media and big data and crunching data in a way that you can isolate individuals, so that if you and I live next door to each other, I get the message that I should vote Trump because he's fairly left, and you get the message that you should vote Trump because he's fairly right. And it's carefully delivered to us, specifically targeted. So people vote for somebody for a whole raft of reasons, which are not ideological necessarily. It's disturbing, frankly.
No, it absolutely is, and I wonder just how sharp they are, because I had one in 2016, I had dinner beside the Trump state headquarters in South Carolina. And after that, I've received, it's only just dried up, thankfully. I kept on receiving emails from the Trump campaign. So I have no idea how they got it, whether they bought the credit card details of the restaurant in South Carolina. I have no idea. But anyway, I got on the list.
Yeah. I think that's the whole point of a big data, though. You don't know the trail that you've left behind, but others do because they buy it. Yeah. And then they buy access to your Facebook page or to Twitter or whatever social media is big in your life. And then they sort of feed these lines, highly specified, partial, perhaps, information, enough to manipulate you into thinking, gracious, this is I need to do something about this. But maybe things will change now. I don't know about Joe Biden. I assume he got elected the same way with a lot of polling going on in the background. I'd be astonished if that weren't the case.
Oh, I think so. And he didn't ignore Pennsylvania and so on. I mean, I think one of the issues with the Clinton campaign was they just took the Rust Belt states votes for granted. Yeah. So they had some holes in their polling, in the way that they applied themselves to the evidence of their polling.
Yeah, yeah. So, I was struck too by watching a guy called, I think, Rob Shorthouse talking about how he won the 2014 referendum for no. And he produced this video, and he said that was entirely based upon the polling they were doing, which showed that yes were ahead, but the weaknesses in the yes message were the following, and we specifically addressed those. I thought that was because I just wondered how much polling was done on the yes side.
I don't know. I think that there was a lot of understandable focus on sterling, a bit less on Europe. I mean, the evidence that certainly I've seen suggests that although 45% of Polish Scots voted for the SNP in 2011, only about a third of them voted yes because they thought they would have to. There was a risk Scotland would leave the EU in the event of independence. So I think that wasn't perhaps focused on as much as it could be, but I think the standout was pensions.
Yeah,
I think that was. I mean, obviously that was to the core no vote market because it's like Brexit, it's a demographic vote. But there was very little reassurance formally in terms of repeating a very solid message on the yes side about that.
Yeah, and also. And again, this is a lesson from US politics, it seems to me. There was almost no negativity on the yes side. And I think that left me with the impression anyway that the yes was a one-club golfer. It was all resolutely positive in an environment which was very mixed. And I think if that is the case, you tend to lose because people are accustomed to hearing plus and minus. And I think you have to sort of perhaps respond to that in a meaningful way. Who knows?
I think that's right. But of course, there are some unanticipated things that came out of yes losing. One of which was the enormous dividend for the SNP in Scotland on the back of Labour lining up so straightforwardly with the Tories in 2015. Yeah. I mean, it's so obvious what you need to do. You need to say, we've got a different offer. We can call it federalism, though nobody knows what that is. Well, they do know what it is, but they certainly wouldn't want it if they did. But you have a different offer. You say, vote Labour in the 2015 general election, you'll get the offer. Don't vote yet, no now, but don't vote. But the Tories aren't doing anything positive for Scotland. Vote Labour. That was it's so obvious. You don't have to be an ace strategist. You just have to have any sense. And actually fronting a Tory campaign has done them nothing but harm.
Yeah, that was a classic mistake. Yeah.
But, they intend on repeating it.
Yeah, it looks like it. Yeah. It is very, very odd. In this show, I talk to people on all sides of the constitutional question, if I can call it that. And in talking to some people on the sort of non-independence perspective, their response to me is, well, we're not unionists. We rather resent people describing us as unionists because we're actually home rulers. We don't accept that we're unionists. We're home rulers. And how does that work? Well, it's called federalism. It's dead easy. They do it in Canada, etc., etc. And I go on to point out, and I think you have done too, more eloquently, I have to say, that constitutionally it's a mare's nest in the UK. You have to persuade somebody who doesn't want something that it's hugely desirable. That is to say to Westminster, I know you have no appetite for this, but you've got to do it for some greater purpose to keep the Scots happy. And I can't for the life of me think that that's going to happen. But
no, all the debates we are now having that were had in Ireland in the 1880s and 90s, the end of the discussions was very similar. A.V. Dicey in 1886 made the same arguments about devolution being a lopsided constitutional settlement as had been around since the 1970s. The West Lothian question is not new. It was asked in 1886. And the point about federalism is that federalism means that powers are entrenched. And the whole point of Westminster is that that the sovereignty of Parliament is absolute and illimitable. Yeah. And entrenched powers and an illimitable sovereignty do not mix. That's the end. So I get very bored of federalism because I hear people who would kind of like things not to be easier than they are, saying, oh, well, this is the solution. Fewer now than once. People are kind of giving up. They realize that this game's a bogey. But for so long, there were people who kind of wished that it would all be easy and that a big gift would come, saying, love the United Kingdom to Scotland, we care. And in it would be a lovely constitutional settlement which would enable us to do everything we wanted, except to make nasty decisions about foreign policy and make our own way in the world, which would be the most terrifying ones. And so would be well to avoid if we were going to be scaredy and want not to get above ourselves. And we've been saying a lot of people don't get above themselves. And, I think that's running out, that's getting exhausted because people don't believe it anymore. But I actually think there was something wrong with it. I'll be bold enough to go and say that, which is that when you talk about horizons, how you are in the world, how you're perceived in the world, and what you do in the world is a fundamental part of who you are as a country, because all sovereignty is, any Leave voters listening, all sovereignty is relational and conditional, and that's its nature. So you don't actually find out who you are until you interact with other people in the same way. That's what being a normal country is.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And also, you've had a great deal of experience, Murray, in other countries. So you have a real sense of how Scotland is viewed elsewhere. Tell us what that is and tell us why that's important.
Okay, well, from the beginning, from many years ago, I've been conscious that Scotland is celebrated across the world. You don't want to get this out of proportion. People don't spend all their days thinking about Scotland. But if you were to look at the evidence as it's presented in the annual GfK Roper survey of national brands, which has been commissioned by the Scottish Government since 2008, which has 50 countries in it, Scotland ranks about 15th in terms of perception. The top country usually, and I'm taking figures now which may be a couple of years out of date, but this is normally the way it breaks down, who recognize Scotland as having an independent national culture. That's most recognized in Russia, where it's about 82%. And really? It's recognized in France, where it's 43%. Which, despite the old alliance and all the rest of it, France is the one which at least recognizes Scotland. But across the Pacific Rim, it's 60 to 70 fairly regularly, and it's about 2/3 in Poland, places like that. So there's a lot of recognition, and of course, as people know, there are Caledonian societies, Caledonian games, Caledonian festivals everywhere. We show a lack of interest in, for example, the 10 or 20,000 strong festivals, of which there are quite a number across continental Europe, which celebrates Scotland and Scottishness every year. And actually, one of the things that's bothered me, is the distaste showed by some kind of Scottish cultural gurus and historians and so on for the situation in the United States, and things like kirking the tartan, sneering that's inauthentic. In Dublin, nobody has any problem with plastic leprechauns on St. Patrick's Day. Being kitsch is being confident. It's not actually being weak. If you understand your brand, then you can manipulate it. And that may sound horrible and lacking in integrity, but actually it's one of the ways in which we negotiate reality. So, and all countries do. We're really lucky. We've got a great global brand. The interesting is that it's actually rooted in the Romantic period. It's rooted in castles, history, the supernatural, the landscape, pipes, tartan. People know that brand. And if you look at what people understand about Scotland's science, Scotland isn't ranked in the top 20 countries for science, but actually, per capita, after Switzerland, it's the second most cited country in the world for science. So that actually, there are a lot of things. I mean, I did a briefing for the External Affairs Department of Scottish Government there, away day in 2018, and have had a lot of connection with them over the years in this and other spheres. That actually, one of the great opportunities of promoting Scotland abroad and getting people on side is understanding the gap, what your brand is now, understanding the gap about how you can promote what your brand could be. A modern country, technology based on renewables, combined with the tourism and all the things that people want and expect to see when they visit Scotland, and how you could help bridge the gulf between the two. Just to take one example, 9.5 million people a year attend barn suppers worldwide, and I've been to a lot of big barn suppers across the world where they're big selling opportunities for Scottish produce. But often it's much better now than it was. But a few years ago, often there was kind of no engagement and no interest. And now the Department of International Trade, the UK government, have really taken up burns, so they're aware of it, and so are we. But I did this report to the Scottish government on Robert Burns, the Scottish economy, which was debated at Holyrood a year ago now in January. And that suggested that Burns alone is worth 200 million plus around 140 million embedded brand value.
Ooh, my.
And that's in an undeveloped situation. The whole area, like Dumfries and Galloway, which is changing now, but which actually didn't know why people visited it. Kind of really useful to know why people visit you. And there is a lot more potential, not just in Burns, but in other areas of cultural tourism too, because of course, tourism is an absolutely huge industry in normal times for Scotland's GDP per capita. Yeah,
I couldn't agree more. I remember fairly vividly being in Chicago on St. Patrick's Day, and they poured green stuff into the
absolutely
into the river.
Embrace it.
Absolutely. You think, why? And the answer was, why not?
Exactly. So, on the one hand, you've got, Smart Dublin, the huge Internet of Things initiative that's going on in Dublin now, including a €1 billion business and technology campus run by Trinity College Dublin. State-of-the-art stuff. I mean, I did a summit on the creative economy in Glasgow and Dublin there 2 years ago. Brilliant place. And at the same time, you've got the confidence to, embrace, pouring green liquid away on St. Patrick's Day, because that is confidence. It is confident to be able to wear your own kitsch and not to grumble about it or complain or say we're all, victims of our own myths and all this sort of thing.
Yeah, sometimes we're a bit too introspective and we don't project as much as we ought.
Horizon, absolutely.
I couldn't agree more.
Of us so much more important in so many ways than what we think of ourselves.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about Glasgow University. Maybe if we've got time, we can come back to some of that previous discussion, Murray. What is your job like? As I described you as a vice principal. What is a vice principal? What's it you do? What does your job entail?
Right, first of all, I'm pro vice principal.
Pro vice. I do beg your pardon.
Yeah, that's right. So vice principal just generally has a brief. So I was either a brief of line managing part of the university.
Yeah.
And so for a few years, I was one of the university's 5 main budget holders and was vice principal in charge of arts. So either that kind of brief or a thematic brief, cross-cutting. It's a matrix system, so cross-cutting brief about the whole of research across the university. So there are obvious points of intersection, and you could say, that there are different ways of doing it, but the aim there is to ensure, in a very complex organization, that very little falls through the gaps. And you can do quite a lot. I mean, one of the things I was, really, really pleased about was in that job in art on the art side was ensuring we got the agreement across Scotland to found the first national graduate school in arts and humanities in Scotland, which we still have, which has attracted an awful lot of funding, an awful lot of students, and has got now more than 100 industry partners. So that's really important. In the terms of the job I'm currently doing, what's it like on a day-to-day basis? Well, it is a very varied job. I think that's one way of putting it. So one of the things among the things that I've done is chair the Kelvin Hall development from the university's side, which obviously the first part of which opened 5 years ago, and they won quite a few, or was nominated for quite a few prizes when it opened, and got 1 million visitors in the first year. I mean, then obviously visitors dropped down after that, and of course they've been very low in the last year for all the obvious reasons. But the interesting there is that was part of bringing together the Hunterian Museum's Research Centre with sport and with the National Library for Scotland, actually the Scottish hub of the UK Sound Archive, and also the Scottish Screen Archive. And the point, it's about horizon and about doing different things together. So the point that you could actually have 5-year-olds playing table tennis in the same building as tea dancers, and the same building as people working on the composition of pigments in 17th century paintings, and that sometimes these were the same people. That, I think, is one of the things that I really, really pleased with in terms of the phase 1 of Kelvin Hall. I mean, I haven't been able to do, because of the various financial constraints, phase 2 yet, but really bringing people together and giving them new horizons has been tremendous. And one of the other things I do, and I do quite a lot with building external partnerships with the university, and particularly, I mentioned Ireland already, so we haven't again interrupted, but quite a lot of good partnership discussions with institutions and bodies in Ireland, including University College Dublin in the last year, 18 months. And I also run the university's early career development program. So that's more than 500 staff in their first few years. And again, that's fundamentally all the way up to the promotion to senior lecturer, which is supposed to happen from 8 years when they're first appointed. And so basically it's a program. It's got a lot of support. It's got high expectations, but people meet the expectations. And it is all about raising the expectations people have got, so that without stretching or pushing very able people too much, you give them the environment to thrive in, and you give them challenges. And they really have that program was initiated 8 years ago by Andrea Nolan, who's now principal at Napier. And it's brilliant in terms of what it's done for the institution and for the careers of the people who have been pursuing it. So very, very strongly developmental. I did want to stress that as with other themes, that theme throughout, rather, in its different manifestations. So that's I also do a lot of research and projects, but that's what I do on the kind of most of the day job side. Yeah.
So I mean, there must be some special challenges when it comes to COVID. I mean, you've got all of these students. We interviewed a student earlier, Sophie Johnson, who's at Glasgow University, and she was in halls of residence, and she spoke about the particular challenges that they had, not so much from the local kids, but people who travel from overseas.
Absolutely.
I mean, how do you cope with all of that? I mean,
it was very difficult right in October. We moved some of the start dates into January. So, I mean, it hasn't helped much as it turns out, but I mean, we thought it might, things might have got better. And there were some issues with infection and people going into self-isolation in the beginning of the September-October term. That's as it were calmed down a good deal. And one of the interesting things I think we're finding is that people do want to be in residence. I mean, people have the ability to learn remotely. Yeah. But once again, when I go back to what I said about meeting people, and university is not an experience you can entirely replicate online. Actually, teaching is easier to do online than a lot of it. Yeah. But not that it's been a big challenge for people who've really, really pulled the stops out to do as well as they possibly could delivering it. So I'm not saying it's easy, but you can't replicate meeting your peers and learning from them. You can't replicate it. Yeah. So it's no surprise to me people do want to be in residence, even though there's not a lot they can do when they get here.
Yeah, and particularly at that age.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's the very age, seems to me, Murray, where you want to interact with your peers, where you want to be challenged, you want people to contradict you. I mean, that's the growing experience, it seems to me.
Exactly, and to do that with people from a whole range of different backgrounds. And, a university is particularly, a big major research university is a particularly good place to do that because people want to come from all over the world. And, that makes a huge difference to the experience people have there.
So in terms of the student population at Glasgow, is that I mean, somebody once told me there was a very high proportion of people from China. Is that the case? Is that is right? Yes. I mean, it is. I mean, I wouldn't like to go to the stake on the statistic, but it's about 15% these days. Yeah. Yeah. And does the university very much depend on the income that these students bring or generate?
I think. Overseas students generally are a very important source of funding for universities to be able to do what they do, because obviously, in England, anyone who's talking in normal times now, anyone who's paying £9,250 fees for a history degree, that is a significant amount more than anyone will be reimbursed by the Scottish government for teaching a home student in Scotland. So they get. So in other words, we couldn't accumulate money to improve buildings and facilities, to stock libraries, and to provide things for students from the formula funding we get for home students. Got it. And that's a general issue for universities generally. Yeah. I've
had a particular question, which I'm going to read because I'm not sure the technicality of it immediately jumps out at me, but to the degree that it ought to be meaningful. Somebody has written in to say a student, last year and this academic year is extremely challenging for University of Glasgow students, in particular for junior and senior honours students. Why has the no detriment policy been removed? Surely during a pandemic, students need as much support and understanding as they can from the university.
That I don't think that I can. I'm not aware of that, but I don't think I can comment on it. I'm afraid, John.
What is the no detriment policy? What is the no detriment policy?
Well, it's the no detriment is where you don't actually suffer, and your worst mark can be your worst mark can be taken off. It's that kind of things. You don't suffer basically from a particularly bad outcome in one area. But as I say, this is definitely not my specialism, so I'm not the right person to answer that question.
Okay. Well, moving on, as they say. Dee Rose has submitted a question. She said, how does Murray see a future no campaign being organised? Would Better Together, does he suspect Better Together would be headed by Gordon Brown, or does he think each party will field its own campaign? unlike last time?
I would be surprised. I mean, we were talking, this is on the expectation there will be an independence referendum, obviously. If there is such a referendum, I would be surprised if there was anything other than a single better together offer as of last time, because they will be the no side or the remain in the union side, whatever you call it, will be extremely concerned at the prospect of losing, and they will not want to run a divided front. I've got a long enough memory, it's sad to say, that I remember in 1979 the fragmentation of the yes side in the devolution campaign together compared to the unity of the no side helped to lower the vote in favor of devolution in 79. So I think, although I don't think that a lot of political practice in today's UK takes enough account of the lessons of political history, I think that's one thing that won't be replicated, and there will be a unified campaign. Would Gordon Brown front it? Who knows? I mean, he is the greatest living Scottish statesman, and so quite possibly.
Yeah. It may well be that he would then be confronted with all these vows that haven't quite been fulfilled, which might make life difficult. But
who will report the vows?
Yeah,
and they're not being fulfilled. I mean, it's a bit like, and I, was involved in going over this in discussion with the Scottish government, the white paper leading to the Internal Markets Bill. There are some horrors in the Internal Markets Bill, and they haven't really gone away, even with some of the clauses being taken out. And a lot of the horrors around frameworks and governance, but also people don't report it, and they don't make an issue of it on the news. It's very difficult to get that on the agenda. That's been on the agenda in social media and nowhere else. But it's incredibly important to the future of the devolved settlement, let alone independent.
Yeah. Well, maybe what we ought to be doing here on TNT is maybe devoting an entire show to the Internal Market Bill and its consequences, or possible consequences. Because I agree with you. I mean, the small contact I've had with people who've taken some time to look through some of its interesting chapters suggests to me that it's a recasting of the entire constitutional connection that Scotland has with the rest of the UK, and done without consultation, done without any sort of debate or any such thing.
It's really smart in that, with the sleight of hand it has in so many ways. One of the ways is it acknowledges that Scottish law is protected by the Union of 1707, but it doesn't acknowledge that Scottish law ever created a legal framework which could protect any other body apart from Scottish law itself. And yet, of course, the jurisdiction of a country is central to its to regulation, organizations, and so on. And that's one of the reasons why, the EIS got up in arms, because they realized it wouldn't, that there wouldn't be any Scottish veto over teaching qualifications in Scottish schools under the IMB. So it was clever, because it said it paid lip service to the Union settlement of 1707, but it did so by pretending that law was just about law and not about a jurisdiction and the regulations and secondary effects that law has in the governance of a country.
And is there anything in the Internal Market Bill that you came across that would impact universities in the way they're governed?
Well, I think there absolutely is. I mean, there are in terms of fees. It's a moot point whether Scottish universities would be able to offer free tuition with the full impact of the Internal Markets Bill, because that would be discrimination within the UK market. Yeah. It might be solved by certain forms of the common frameworks, but as I said, the governance for this, for disputes in the IMB, is really elusive. It's a bit like the governance about what happens in the Brexit deal. Which actually is arbitration is mentioned and going back to negotiation is mentioned, but there's no sense of what all the governance seems to be reduced to politics. And it is fundamentally the same way in the IMB as well. So yeah, it could have a real effect on Scottish universities depending how it's implemented.
And there would I take it there would be no, there's no consultative process. I mean, the IMB simply says this is a decision for a minister of the Crown.
It doesn't say that explicitly. It's interesting, in the 1920 Government of Ireland Act, the Exchequer Board, which then went on to work with Northern Ireland, which was about not having obviously most of Ireland became the Free State, actually had a named membership which included parliamentary representatives, expert representatives, and a non-political chair. That was all specified in the Act. Doesn't happen in the IMB. It doesn't say it'll be a minister of the Crown, but it doesn't very clearly say it won't. So my advice is always, don't expect any nice surprises, and I think that will at least be held in reserve if a common framework cannot be agreed. It's by no means clear that the IMB will be used, because it will cause a political storm in all the areas where it could be used. But the very fact it's held in reserve. So rather like the fact that the citizenship exam now has a bit saying that the devolved parliaments are solely a creation of Westminster, which didn't used to be in the citizenship exam. These are all indicators that actually the old saw power devolved as power retained is actually for the first time going to be implemented, at least to some extent, and when the Scottish government gets too troublesome by the British government.
This all sounds like some sort of extreme form of what's the old term, rough wooing. It's a sort of.
Yes, yeah.
And when I've talked to conservative commentators, they deplore this. This is not simply deplored by people who take an enlightened view, a progressive view. It's deplored by people who are conservative. They tell me, they say this is shocking. Why are they doing this? They don't understand it.
Well, I think one of the big this is as it were a part of a trajectory. So I haven't really talked about some of the research that I've done over the years, which I guess more than administering universities is why we're here tonight. But bluntly, Scotland had a national self which it was able to project abroad during the British Empire. Scottish unionism, the kind of tradition represented by Buchan, and which ended with the merger with the Conservative Party in 1965. I have to keep on telling people that, I remember, that actually Conservatives didn't get a majority in Scotland in 1955. It was the Unionists, including the Liberal Unionists, not the Conservative Party. Yeah. So, but the Scottish unionism was very much about the importance of Scotland within Great Britain.
Yeah.
And that's now gone. And what's happened is there's been a gradual replacement of an imperial four nations identity with a British homogenous identity, because the only sustainable identity coming out of empire was, first of all, to make Britain more homogenous than in the imperial era people understood it to be. So many Victorian posters with pictures of Caledonia and Hibernia and all these folk hanging around Britannia. So that was the first thing. The second was that there was no foundational myth that was possible except standing alone in World War II. Yeah. And that and the 45-51 government with its nationalisation agenda and no postcode lottery, unitary service structure, NHS that followed it, that became the new national myth. And that has had enormous difficulty with Scotland throughout. The attempt to extirpate Scottish difference has been going now for about 50 years. And some of it was accidental, and some of it's deliberate, and some of it's caused by global markets. Yeah. But, it's unthinkable, for example, take my own sector, that, when Edinburgh was the first Scottish university to join a central admission system in the 1960s, the students protested. And indeed, when I went to university, there were still three outside a central admission system. So all of those things have all changed in a way to create a single UK-ness, or the belief in a single UK-ness. And that has been, left Scotland with less and less air to breathe. We talked about the hubs and Scottish representation externally earlier on. A century ago, Scots were associating themselves across the globe in order to stop English people getting jobs, to put it bluntly. I'm not saying that was a good thing, but that's how Scottish associations worked in many of the parts of the British Empire. They were there to prefer and to exclude.
Did you know somebody once told me that you know the Hsbc Bank?
Yes, indeed.
For many people, it was seen as an acronym for Home for Scottish Bank Clerks, because of
absolutely. Well,
so many Scots wielded power.
Well, one of its founding lights, Thomas Sutherland, who actually was also chair of P&O, was a fellow Aberdonian. But, one of the things he did was he was MP for Greenock for 20 years. And while he was MP for Greenock, he was chair of P&O. And the Greenock Yards got 80 ship contracts.
Yeah.
People would call it a conflict of interest today, but then it was just good business.
Now, bearing in mind what you've just said, that toured the horizon about the extirpation of the Scottish viewpoint, perhaps. What's your take on, because David is asking this question, what is Professor Murray's Pittock's take on the Section 30 discussion, debate, the case? Now, I think probably what he means is that in the light of what you've been saying, is there any real value in pursuing that in the way that it's being pursued?
If I was the British government, I wouldn't be responding to it on the basis of an SNP majority with the Greens or alone. There is a way, I think this is very short term. There are real structural problems in keeping on just saying no. Again, the obvious thing to do, rather like Labour in the Better Together era, is to allow a referendum and to rig it, probably not by having a threshold, but by having a third question.
Yeah.
Third question would be a great rig, especially if the third question contains, some motherhood and apple pie vow style stuff.
Yeah.
So that's a possibility. I don't exactly rule that out, but the basic track record of the Conservative Party suggests they'll just say no. And they'll hang on saying no for as long as they possibly can. I realize there'll be a legal challenge. I personally will, or a number of legal challenges, and of course there's one already underway. Yeah. I personally think it's not very likely that judges in Scotland or in the Supreme Court will want to have the responsibility for making the political decision, for that's what it would be, whether or not there'd be a referendum. And I also think there are very difficult issues here. So, I think a lot of people are very passionate and want to have action really quickly. There are a lot of difficult issues, and one of them is that Scottish accession to the EU is definitely more at risk from Spain's veto without a Section 30 order or the equivalent. Whether they would accept, and they might accept, a legal route through, if that were to happen, that's possible. But they're obviously, having enormous difficulties themselves because fundamentally they didn't respect an earlier referendum in Catalonia. So it's the 2006 referendum that's a real problem here.
Yeah. It will be very, very interesting. One of the issues that keeps coming up, and I'd like to go back to it, if I may, was your point about the Conservatives and the Unionists combining. When I talk to Conservative supporters, I sometimes get the impression, though they do retrench and go and walk back from this, but there's been a strong suggestion on several occasions where people have said to me that they're not sure if Conservatives and the Unionists can remain bedfellows, particularly in the light of the democratic pressure of saying no to a Section 30. One of the pressure points will be how many people wish to remain Conservatives and Unionists who might have fallen into the category you described earlier of being Scottish Conservatives or Scottish Unionists, perhaps. Their vision is not a highly centralised state operating by diktat, and they might find that sufficiently uncomfortable to decide to do otherwise. What's your sense of that? You get any feeling about that at all?
I'm not sure I'm not sure that I've got enough evidence to reach a view about that. I tend to think that they were besieged organizations tend to hang together. And if we see this Conservative Unionist Party in Scotland as besieged, then the chances are it will hang together, whatever the internal tensions are. Of course, if it loses all its seats, or is reduced to a very much a marginal position, as has been the case before, it may change its mind. I mean, the embracing of devolution by the Conservatives did help them eventually after a few years.
Yeah.
But one is never quite sure, because one of the things that's been really interesting to me watching is the way in which Labour has gone from centre stage to the wings, to being kicked into the orchestra stalls, and every time they're put even further on the back foot, they say exactly the same things, as if as if the voters will awake from their collective delusion and rush back into the arms of the policies that they've been rejecting for 15 or 20 years. Yeah. It's very interesting, because Henry McLeish saw the way the wind was blowing 20 years ago. And I have to say, I really respect him for that. I think maybe he's kind of too positive about the federalist solution, in terms of the fact he knows the workings of Westminster and so on, and that they're not very likely to entertain it. But nonetheless, he really did see. He offered a way forward for the Labour Party in devolution, and they didn't take it, and they've been suffering from that ever since.
Yeah. Yeah. If you were to look ahead, we don't have much time left, Murray, I'm afraid. But if as they say in the States, if you could take this chance to look down the pike to the end of 2021 and draw us a picture of Scotland and the UK and how you see things working out and developing, what would it be? What do you envisage?
I envisage, providing the election happens on time, and I really don't have any idea why elections can't happen on time, even in the current circumstances, given what has happened elsewhere, that there will be major political pressure in the autumn, and that it will be resisted. And I think, and as I said, I'm not convinced myself the legal cases will go through. So I think we may be in a heightened state of where we are now, which isn't very comfortable. And I appreciate nobody in particular listening to this wants to hear it, but that may be the case. So combined with pressure via the Internal Markets Bill and other areas on the Scottish government to keep it on the back foot. In these circumstances, I think it's very important that the Scottish government, in terms of talking horizons again, is as active abroad, not only with organizations and institutions and governments and with the diaspora, but with the diaspora, where there are diasporic organizations of strength to plug into, and that is quite a few places, as possible. And I don't mean pushing straightforwardly an independence agenda or anything like that. I mean just getting Scotland and Scotland's position and take on things and outlook profiled in the world. It's very difficult to move forward without friends outside. And one of the lessons from Catalonia in 2017 is that they didn't have very many friends outside. It was very difficult for the EU to sanction that referendum. I appreciate all the difficulties. But what was very clear is they kind of expected people to say, oh gosh, look, they want to leave Spain, let's help them. Not a chance. There was no preparing of any real ground. Whereas if you look, not a situation we want to be in or go back to, but if you look at the funding from US bondholders of the Irish government or provisional government in the late teens and early 20s, it was really significant. Funding, engagement, profile, international interest, these things all matter, and they're all part of the pressure of the political process, just as much and even more so than the passions and difficulties and desires that people feel in Scotland itself.
That's very helpful, Murray. Well, that's been very educational, if you'll excuse me. Thank you very much indeed. Our time's almost up. A big thank you to Murray, obviously, and a big thank you to all of you, and thank you for your questions. As ever, we have a formidable list of guests lined up, Now, look out next week for child expert Sue Palmer. One of Sue's thoughts is that perhaps children should start school at 7 and not at 6. And you really don't, if you genuinely believe, as I do, that the future lies with our children, you really don't want to miss Sue Palmer next week. Her book is called Toxic Childhood. That's one of her books. And look out for the Constitution column. Dr. Elliot Bulmer is writing it this week in the Sunday National. You should never miss Elliot's column. It's very worthwhile. And also, please support IndyLive. Remember, go to the IndyLive guide. It's on What's On. It's called www.WhatsOnGuide.scot because IndyLive is not just a TNT show. There's a whole bunch of offerings, and it's done on a shoestring with volunteers, and they do it because they love Scotland, they love you, and they want to deliver what they think might be helpful to you. So do support them. And remember, it's been a great day for British democracy. You might like to learn, as of today, the UK suffered more COVID deaths in the last 24 hours. That's 1,041 than Australia has experienced since the start of the pandemic. So somebody somewhere is managing it reasonably well. Again, a big thank you to Murray. Thank you very much, Murray. And please, let's all keep in touch. Thank you again. Good night, everyone. Take care.
Never miss a live stream. The What's On Guide to live stream events and shows now has its own website. You can find the guide at WhatsOnGuide.scot, IndependenceLive.net, or on multiple Facebook pages. Do you create your own live stream events and shows? Get them registered on the guide. See WhatsOnGuide.scot for full details.
This is a new voice for a new Scotland.
We know you're busy people, so most of our shows are also on demand on our Scottish Independence podcast channel, available wherever you get your podcasts. You'll see what a great variety of shows we have. There's something for everyone. Our newest on-demand platform is IndyLive Radio's YouTube channel. We have set up playlists for our most popular shows and current topics, currency, disc parties. New content is added almost daily, so subscribe and you won't miss anything. Join us. Thanks for listening.
IndyLive.radio. can watch this again. You can be part of it. It's Independence Live. Yeah. A few people asked about YouTube. It'll be YouTube/Independence Live. That's where you'll find the footage.
It's not acceptable to say we just keep on trying and we have another mandate and we have another mandate, we keep on trying. You've got to make a political judgment that it's not going to work and say, well, in that case, we have either got to admit that we're not going to go for independence. And this is where I think the government has not been honest with people. That is, I'm not saying it will happen. I'm just saying that it is at least a possibility. If we hone in totally on Section 30, we could not get a referendum at all under Section 30. And therefore, that to me means that you've got to find another way.
But I don't think anybody who's gone over to yes now is really for moving, because I think they can see clear as day what things look like. And I always felt that during the independence referendum that it would take a no vote in order for a lot of Scots to realise the consequences of voting no. They would have to see what happens when they vote no in order to realise what a mistake it was.
And to me, that's the clear blue water between staying in the UK and going for independence. It's clear, regardless of what Boris Johnson said the other day, that they will want to go back to business as usual, where the ultra-rich are the ones who gain from everything. Mm. We don't want to be part of that. We want the chance to actually build a fairer country.
It's the Brexit stuff for me, the nepotism stuff for me, breaking international law stuff for me, the ERG hijacking UK democracy stuff for me, education is a luxury stuff for me, £9,000 tuition a year stuff for me, it's the NHS on the table for a US trade deal stuff for me, demonising the working classes stuff for me, refusing starving children free school meals stuff for me, it's Boris calling Muslim women letterboxes stuff for me, his pickaninnies comments stuff for me, his bum boys comments stuff for me, his Scotland is a verminous race comments stuff for me, the UK internal market bill ripping up the devolution settlement stuff for me, devolved legislators being ignored during Brexit stuff for me, a lack of UK leadership during COVID stuff for me, nuclear weapons being in Scotland stuff for me, a decade of Tory government Scotland didn't elect stuff for me, it's a weak left opposition in England stuff for me, attempting to frame independence as anti-English bigotry stuff for me, it's trying to ban anti-capitalist references in schools stuff for me, it's England-centric lefties painting SNP as a protest vote even though Scottish Labour is spineless stuff for me, it's the UK for me.
Hi there, I'm Cliff.
And I'm Russ.
And we're from the Veterans for Scottish Independence 2.0 group. And we're just invading your privacy today to let you know that we will be very shortly pushing a programme out on live stream to do with the veterans, their needs, as it will be during an independent campaign. The next independence campaign, and indeed in independent Scotland.
So get yourself in gear, come and join us, pull up a sandbag.
Yes.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.
Never miss a live stream. The What's On Guide to live stream events and shows now has its own website. You can find the guide at WhatsOnGuide.scot, IndependenceLive.net, or on multiple Facebook pages. Do you create your own live stream events and shows? Get them registered on the guide. See WhatsOnGuide.scot for full details.
It's a song I wrote about 5 minutes ago called Carpe Diem, Hope Over Fear. Are you threatened by words from an empire of money and gold? Will you trade in your country's potential for the lies you've been sold? Are you scared that the walls are too high to be breached by the bold? Will you stand and be counted, or shut up and do what you're told? Hope over fear, don't be afraid. Tell Westminster Tories that Scotland's no longer your slave. Carpe Diem, will you seize the day? Rip the chains from the unicorn, Scotland's no longer your slave. Did the TV man call you a nationalist for rejecting the lies? Are the wobbs of the few off the bob cause they wear shirts and ties? When they tell you that Scotland's no great, are you really surprised? Will you stand and be counted for something that money can't buy? Hope over fear, don't be afraid. Tell Westminster Tories that Scotland's no longer your slave. Carpe Diem, will you seize the day? Rip the chains from the unicorn, Scotland's no longer your slave. Happy that nuclear weapons are dumped on the Clyde, fighting wars for the wealth of the few. How many have died? You can bury my bones, but the truth of it can't be denied. Will you stand and be counted, cause I'll be there stood by your side. Hope over fear, don't be afraid. Tell Westminster Tories that Scotland's no longer your slave. Carpe Diem, will you seize the day? Rip the chains from the unicorn, Scotland's no longer your slave. Will the media tell you that England don't want you to go? And the taxpayer-funded MPs tell you just tell them no. No! But in Manchester, Nottingham, Sheffield, they already know that we're fighting for them, and it's only the start of the show. Ha ha! Hope over fear, don't be afraid. Tell Westminster Tories that Scotland's no longer your slave. Carpe Diem, my friend, will you seize the day? With the chains from the unicorn, Scotland's no longer your slave. Vote yes for a future. Hope over fear.